The rusted lock cracked under Sarah's desperate hands as rain pounded the rotting roof of the forgotten barn outside Millerville. With nowhere else to go and only $17 to her name, this crumbling structure was her last hope for shelter. But Sarah Chen wasn't just another homeless woman seeking refuge. 3 years ago, she'd been one of the world's most celebrated architects, designing billion-dollar skyscrapers that touched the clouds. Until the scandal hit, until her partner's betrayal cost her everything, her career, her reputation, her life savings. Now, standing in this derelict barn filled with decades of decay, something clicked. Her trained eyes saw past the broken beams and shattered windows. She saw potential, she saw possibility, she saw redemption. Over the next 6 months, using nothing but salvaged materials and her brilliant mind, Sarah would transform this forgotten space into something that would make international headlines. But as news crews descended and her story went viral, a terrifying question emerged: what happens when the world discovers who she really is? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The barn door groaned open, revealing a cathedral of shadows and neglect. Pigeons scattered from the rafters, their wings beating against the storm outside. Sarah stepped inside, her waterlogged sneakers squelching against what had once been hay-covered floorboards. The air smelled of wet wood, rust, and forgotten dreams. She pulled her threadbare jacket tighter and surveyed her new reality. 3 years of running had led her here, to this moment, this place, this bottom. The rain found every crack in the roof, creating a symphony of drips that echoed through the hollow space. Most people would see only ruin. Sarah saw the bones of something magnificent. Her fingers traced the massive support beam that ran the length of the structure. Hand-hewn oak, probably a century old. The craftsmanship was exquisite, built when people took pride in permanence. These beams could support far more than their current burden of cobwebs and bird nests. Thunder crashed overhead, and Sarah jumped. She needed to focus on immediate concerns, like not dying of hypothermia before morning. In the far corner, she spotted what looked like an old horse stall, partially intact with 3 walls that might offer some protection from the wind. As she made her way across the uneven floor, her foot caught on something metallic. She knelt and brushed away years of debris, revealing an ornate iron grate. Even in the dim light filtering through the storm clouds, she could see the intricate scrollwork. Someone had cared about details once. Someone had seen beauty in function. The stall smelled less offensive than the rest of the barn, dry rot instead of active decay. Sarah settled into the corner, pulling her knees to her chest for warmth. Her stomach growled, reminding her that her last meal had been yesterday's gas station sandwich. The $17 would need to last until she figured out her next move. If there was a next move. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, her mind began working the way it always had, calculating load distributions, imagining sight lines, envisioning how natural light would move through the space during different seasons. The old habits died hard, even when they served no purpose anymore. Or did they? Sarah opened her eyes and really looked at the barn. The structure was roughly 40 by 60 feet, plenty of space to work with. The roof peaked at about 25 feet, creating dramatic vertical potential. Those broken windows could be enlarged, repositioned. The south wall would catch beautiful morning light if properly oriented. She laughed bitterly at herself. Here she was, homeless and broken, still designing buildings that would never exist. Some habits were just too deeply ingrained to break. But as the storm raged on, and sleep continued to elude her, Sarah found herself sketching in the dirt with her finger. Just rough concepts at first, flow patterns, spatial relationships, nothing serious, just something to occupy her mind while she waited for dawn. The rain began to slow around midnight, settling into a steady patter that was almost soothing. Sarah pulled an old tarp she'd found over herself and finally drifted off, her dreams filled with soaring spaces and impossible geometries. She woke to sunlight streaming through the gaps in the walls, painting golden rectangles across the barn floor. For a moment she forgot where she was. The light was actually beautiful, creating natural spotlights that shifted and danced as clouds moved across the sky. Sarah sat up, her body aching from sleeping on the hard ground, and looked at what she'd sketched in the dirt the night before. Even in daylight, the rough drawings showed promise. The space had good bones. Amazing bones, actually. She thought about the property she'd passed on her way here, abandoned farmland stretching for miles, probably tied up in some legal dispute that would keep anyone from caring about one old barn. She thought about her $17 and her empty stomach and her complete lack of options. Then she looked up at those magnificent hand-hewn beams and made a decision that would change everything. The morning sun filtered through the gaps in the weathered barn walls, casting golden strips across the dirt floor where Maya had spent her first night in 3 weeks without looking over her shoulder. She'd slept better than she had since leaving Chicago, though her dreams had been filled with the familiar ghosts, flashing cameras, disappointed faces, and the sound of her world crashing down around her. She pushed herself up from the makeshift bed of old horse blankets, brushing hay from her dark hair. The barn was larger than she'd initially thought, stretching back into shadows that the dawn light hadn't yet reached. Ancient farming equipment sat abandoned in corners like sleeping giants, and overhead, a loft ran the length of the building, accessible by a ladder missing several rungs. Maya walked to the massive doors she'd struggled to close the night before and peered through a crack. The road remained empty, just as it had been when she'd stumbled upon this place. According to the rusted mailbox she'd passed, this was the old Henderson property, though it looked like no one had lived here for years. The farmhouse in the distance sat dark and hollow, its windows like dead eyes watching over forgotten fields, perfect for someone who needed to disappear. She spent the morning exploring her newfound sanctuary, cataloguing its possibilities with an eye trained by years of seeing potential where others saw decay. The barn's bones were solid, good timber, sturdy construction from an era when things were built to last. The foundation was stone and level, and though the roof had a few loose shingles, it was largely intact. In the back corner, she discovered something that made her pulse quicken. Behind a mountain of mouldering hay bales sat an old workbench, and scattered around it were tools, rusty but functional saws, chisels, planes, and drawers full of hardware. Someone had been a craftsman here once, and they'd left their legacy behind. Maya ran her fingers along the workbench's scarred surface, feeling the familiar pull of possibility. She hadn't touched tools like these in over a year, not since her life had imploded in spectacular fashion. But her hands remembered their weight, the way they felt like extensions of her own body when she was creating something beautiful from raw materials. By afternoon, she'd made her first trip into the nearby town of Millbrook, a place that seemed to exist in a time capsule from decades past. The hardware store was run by an elderly man named Frank, who looked at her with curiosity but not suspicion. Her story was simple and mostly true. She was passing through, thinking about staying if she could find work and a place to rent. "The Henderson place, you said?" Frank scratched his graying beard. "Been empty since old Margaret passed 2 years ago. Her nephew lives up in Portland, keeps meaning to do something with it but never does. Can't say he'd mind someone keeping an eye on things, long as you're not looking to cause trouble." "I'm not trouble," Maya assured him, and Frank seemed to believe her. Small-town people had a way of reading character that city folks had forgotten, and whatever he saw in her weathered face and careful eyes seemed to pass his test. She bought basic supplies with the last of her carefully hoarded cash, a few simple tools, some lumber, sandpaper, and a battery-powered radio that would help fill the silence of her self-imposed exile. Frank threw in a thermos of coffee for the road and directions to the county social services office if she needed help finding work. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the abandoned farm, Maya stood in the center of the barn and let herself imagine for the first time in months. Not just survival, but creation. Not just hiding, but building something meaningful from the pieces of her broken life. She pulled out the small notebook she'd carried through 3 states and countless sleepless nights, its pages filled with sketches and half-formed ideas that had sustained her when hope seemed impossible. Now, looking at the space around her with fresh eyes, those fragments began to coalesce into something larger. The barn could become more than shelter. In her mind's eye, she saw workshops and galleries, spaces for teaching and creating, gardens where beauty could grow from neglected soil. She saw people, artists, craftsmen, dreamers who needed a place to nurture their visions. She saw the kind of community she'd once tried to build before ambition and betrayal had torn it apart. But this time would be different. This time, she would be nobody special, just Maya, the woman who drifted into Millbrook looking for a fresh start. Not the celebrated architect whose revolutionary designs had graced magazine covers, not the rising star whose fall from grace had been chronicled in devastating detail across social media, not the woman whose trust in the wrong person had cost her everything. Just Maya, standing in an abandoned barn, holding possibility in her calloused hands. The first visitors arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Maya had installed the last of her wind chimes. She heard their voices before she saw them, a mother's gentle coaxing and a child's excited squeals echoing across the meadow. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against the barn's interior wall, peering through a gap in the weathered wood. A woman in a yellow sundress held the hand of a boy who couldn't have been more than 6, his red sneakers bright against the wild grass. "Look, Mama," the child's voice carried pure wonder. "It's like a fairy castle." The mother stopped walking, her free hand rising to cover her mouth. Maya watched the woman's expression shift from cautious curiosity to something approaching awe. The morning light caught the glass bottles and mirror fragments Maya had woven throughout the structure, casting dancing rainbows across both visitors' faces. Maya had spent countless hours over the past month transforming the barn into something that defied easy description. What had once been a hollow shell of rotting wood and rusted nails now breathed with color and movement. Hundreds of glass bottles, each one carefully cleaned and positioned, created walls that seemed to shimmer and pulse with the changing light. Strips of fabric in every imaginable hue fluttered from the rafters like prayer flags, while mirrors of all shapes and sizes reflected and multiplied the beauty until it became almost overwhelming. The wind chimes she'd crafted from discarded metal sang their gentle songs, each one tuned to complement the others in a symphony that seemed to speak directly to the soul. Garden beds carved from old tires and wooden crates burst with wildflowers and vegetables she'd coaxed from seeds found in abandoned packets. "Can we go inside?" the boy whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. His mother hesitated, scanning the area. "I don't know, sweetheart. Someone must have built this. It belongs to them." Maya closed her eyes, fighting an internal war. Every instinct screamed at her to remain hidden, to wait until they left. She'd survived this long by staying invisible, by never allowing herself to be truly seen. But something about the pure joy in the child's voice, the reverence in his mother's expression, made her chest ache with a longing she'd thought she'd buried years ago. Before she could stop herself, Maya stepped out from behind the barn. Both visitors startled, the mother instinctively pulling her son closer. Maya raised her hands slowly, palms open. "It's okay," she said, her voice rusty from disuse. "You can look around if you'd like." The woman studied Maya's face, taking in her weathered clothes and sun-darkened skin, the careful way she held herself at a distance. "This is yours? You built all this?" Maya nodded, not trusting her voice for more words. The boy had already broken free from his mother's grasp and was running toward the nearest wall of bottles, his eyes wide with fascination. "Tommy, be careful," the mother called, but her tone held more wonder than worry. "It's safe," Maya managed. "Everything's secured. He can't hurt anything." For the next hour, Maya found herself playing reluctant tour guide. She showed them how the bottles created different colors when the light hit them at various angles, how the mirror placement was designed to make the space feel infinite. The boy was delighted by a section where he could whisper into one bottle and hear his voice emerge from another across the room. Distorted but recognizable. "How did you know to do all this?" the mother asked as Tommy explored a corner where prisms cast tiny rainbows on his hands. The question hit too close to dangerous territory. Maya felt the familiar walls rising, the practiced deflection ready on her tongue. But something in the woman's face, genuine curiosity without judgment, made her pause. "I used to—" Maya started, then stopped. "I've always been good with my hands." It was barely a fraction of the truth, but it was more than she'd shared with anyone in years. When they finally left, the mother pressed a $10 bill into Maya's hand, despite her protests. "For materials," she insisted. "This place, it's magic. Tommy hasn't stopped smiling since we got here." Maya watched them disappear across the meadow, the boy turning back every few steps to wave. She stood there long after they'd vanished, the money crumpled in her fist, feeling something crack open inside her chest. By the end of the week, word had spread. Maya woke each morning to find small groups of people making the trek across the meadow. Families, couples, teenagers with cameras. They came quietly, respectfully, drawn by something they couldn't name but recognized nonetheless. Maya began to realize that in trying to build herself a sanctuary, she'd accidentally created something much more dangerous: hope. The sound of approaching voices jolted Elena from her morning routine. She'd been carefully tending to the small herb garden she'd started behind the barn, her hands still dirty from replanting wild rosemary she'd found growing near the creek. The voices were getting closer, and she could make out at least 3 distinct speakers. Her heart hammered as she crept to the barn's side wall, pressing herself against the weathered wood. Through a gap in the planks, she watched as a small group emerged from the tree line. A woman with a camera hung around her neck led the way, followed by 2 men, one carrying what looked like surveying equipment, the other scribbling notes on a clipboard. "The reports mentioned it was somewhere around here," the woman was saying. "Apparently, hikers have been posting photos on social media. Something about incredible artwork in an abandoned barn." Elena's blood turned cold. Social media. She'd been so careful to choose a location far from any main trails, but she hadn't considered that her work might be visible to passing hikers. The morning light streaming through the barn's high windows would illuminate the interior perfectly for anyone peering inside. There, the man with the clipboard pointed directly at her sanctuary. That has to be it. Elena watched in horror as they approached the front entrance. She'd left it slightly ajar this morning, a mistake that now seemed catastrophic. The woman raised her camera immediately upon seeing inside, and Elena could hear the rapid clicking of the shutter even from her hiding spot. "This is incredible," the woman breathed. "Look at the detail in these murals, the use of natural materials, the way the light plays across the surfaces. This isn't amateur work." The man with the surveying equipment was already setting up his tools. According to the county records, this property has been abandoned for over a decade. No listed owner, no permits for any kind of construction or artistic installation. "Which makes this even more intriguing," the woman replied, never lowering her camera. "Someone with serious artistic training has been working here. This level of sophistication, the way the space has been transformed, we're talking about a professional." Elena closed her eyes, fighting back panic. Professional. If they started digging into who might have the skills to create what she'd built, if they began researching local artists or checking art school databases, it wouldn't take long for someone to connect the dots. Her face had been in newspapers, art journals, gallery announcements. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the rising star in contemporary art who'd vanished without a trace 2 years ago. "I'm calling this in to the paper," the woman continued. "This is front-page material. Mystery artist transforms abandoned barn into masterpiece. The human interest angle alone will get picked up by the regional outlets." The man with the clipboard was walking the perimeter now, documenting everything. "We'll need to contact the county about the legal status of the property. If this is truly abandoned, There might be questions about unauthorized use, even for artistic purposes. Elena felt the walls of her carefully constructed new life beginning to crumble. She thought of the past months of peace, of the simple rhythm of her days, of the gradual healing that had come from creating without the pressure of galleries, critics, and expectations. She thought of Marcus, whose phone calls had finally stopped coming, and of the art world that had both elevated and ultimately destroyed her. The woman was interviewing the man with the clipboard now, asking questions about property law and public art installations. Elena caught fragments of their conversation, words like investigation, ownership, and publicity that made her stomach churn. As the group finally began to pack up their equipment, Elena remained frozen against the barn wall. The woman took one final series of photographs, capturing the exterior now as well as the interior. Before leaving, she placed a small card wedged into the door frame. Elena waited until their voices completely faded before emerging from her hiding spot. Her hands shook as she retrieved the card. Sarah Chen, Arts and Culture Reporter, Regional Tribune. Interested in featuring your work. Please contact. She stared at the card for a long moment, then crumpled it in her fist. But the damage was already done. Within hours, those photographs would be uploaded, processed, and published. By tomorrow, her sanctuary would be crawling with curiosity seekers, reporters, and potentially law enforcement. Worse still, once the images hit the internet, it was only a matter of time before someone recognized her artistic style. The way she layered natural pigments, her signature technique of incorporating found materials into flowing, organic patterns, these were calling cards that had made her famous before everything fell apart. Elena walked slowly back into the barn, seeing it now through the lens of impending loss. Every carefully placed stone, every painted surface, every detail that had brought her such peace now felt like evidence in a case against her own anonymity. The paradise she'd built was about to become her prison. The morning sun cast long shadows across the transformed barn as Maya stood in the doorway, coffee mug warming her hands. 3 weeks had passed since she'd begun her work, and the space barely resembled the derelict structure she'd first discovered. Where rotting boards once gaped, smooth clay now filled the gaps, mixed with straw and sealed with a technique she'd learned from master builders in Morocco. The walls breathed with the space, organic and alive. She'd been careful to work only during daylight hours, mindful that any unusual sounds might draw unwanted attention from the neighboring properties. The nearest house sat a quarter-mile away, but sound carried strangely across these Pennsylvania hills, and Maya had learned long ago that survival depended on invisibility. Her fingers traced the intricate geometric patterns she'd carved into the clay, not the angular, precise designs that had once made her famous, but something softer, more intuitive. These patterns seemed to grow from the earth itself, spiraling upward like vines seeking light. Each morning, she discovered something new in her own work, as if the barn were revealing its secrets gradually, even to her. The transformation went beyond mere renovation. Maya had repositioned the interior supports, creating flowing spaces that drew visitors through the barn in a meandering journey. Natural light filtered through carefully placed openings she'd cut into the roof, illuminating different areas as the sun moved overhead. By evening, the space would be completely transformed, mysterious and cave-like, lit only by the small fire pit she'd constructed in the center. But it was the sound that made the barn truly extraordinary. Maya had discovered this by accident 3 days ago, when a sudden rainstorm had sent her scrambling inside for shelter. As the rain drummed against the roof, she'd noticed how the space caught and amplified the sound, turning precipitation into music. The curved walls and strategic placement of the support beams created a natural acoustic chamber, and every sound, from her footsteps to her breathing, gained an ethereal quality. She'd spent the following days fine-tuning this discovery, adjusting surfaces and angles with the precision that had once earned her international acclaim. Now even a whisper seemed to dance through the air, and she found herself speaking aloud just to hear the magic of her own voice transformed. The irony wasn't lost on her. Dr. Maya Voss, the architect who had designed concert halls and meditation centers across 3 continents, was now homeless and unknown, creating perhaps her greatest work in secret. The woman who had once commanded 6-figure fees for her acoustic innovations was now surviving on food stamps and the occasional odd job, pouring her genius into a forgotten barn that officially belonged to someone else. A distant rumble broke her reverie. Maya tensed, recognizing the sound of an approaching vehicle. She'd grown hypersensitive to such noises, always ready to disappear at a moment's notice. Through a gap in the trees, she caught sight of a white pickup truck turning up the dirt road that led to the old farmhouse. Quickly, Maya gathered her few tools and slipped them into the canvas bag she kept ready by the door. She'd scouted multiple escape routes during her first week here, and muscle memory guided her now toward the back of the barn, where a loose board created an unobtrusive exit. But curiosity made her pause at one of the small windows she'd opened in the east wall. An elderly man climbed out of the truck, moving with the careful deliberation of someone nursing old bones. He wore overalls and a Cardinals baseball cap, and he walked with a slight limp that suggested a lifetime of physical labor. Maya watched as he approached the farmhouse, fishing keys from his pocket. The owner, she realized, or possibly a caretaker. She'd researched the property as thoroughly as possible using the library's public computers, but records had been frustratingly incomplete. The land seemed caught in some kind of legal limbo, not quite abandoned, but not actively inhabited either. The man paused at the farmhouse door, then turned to scan the surrounding property. His gaze swept across the landscape, taking inventory, and Maya held her breath as his eyes moved toward the barn. From the outside, her modifications were subtle. She'd been careful about that. But someone familiar with the property might notice the changes. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and entered the farmhouse. Maya remained frozen at the window, mind racing through possibilities. She could leave now, gather her few possessions and disappear before he discovered her presence. It's what the old Maya would have done. The Maya who had been running for 18 months, staying ahead of the consequences of her past choices. But this barn had become more than shelter. It had awakened something in her that she'd thought was lost forever, buried beneath the weight of guilt and fear. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she felt like herself again, not the broken woman hiding from her mistakes, but the artist who had once changed how people experienced space and sound and light. The farmhouse door slammed shut, and Maya made her decision. The first visitors arrived at dawn, their headlights cutting through the morning mist like searching fingers. Maya watched from the barn's upper loft as 3 cars pulled into the gravel clearing, their occupants emerging with the cautious reverence of pilgrims approaching a shrine. She recognized the body language immediately, the hesitant steps, the way they clutched cameras and phones like talismans, the whispered conversations that carried on the still air. Word had spread faster than she'd anticipated. The local news segment had been picked up by a regional station, then a national blog, and now the digital wildfire was consuming everything in its path. "Incredible," she heard a woman say as the group approached the barn's entrance. "The photos don't do it justice." Maya had spent the night installing motion sensors and speakers throughout the space, programming them to respond to visitors' movements with subtle shifts in lighting and ambient sound. The barn would reveal itself gradually, rewarding patience and contemplation while gently discouraging the aggressive documentation she knew would come. As the first group entered, Maya descended through a concealed passage she'd built between the loft and the basement workshop. She emerged from a hidden panel behind what appeared to be a wall of cascading water, actually thousands of suspended glass droplets that caught and reflected light in mesmerizing patterns. "Welcome," she said simply, her voice seeming to emanate from the installation itself. The visitors startled, then smiled with the delight of children discovering a magic trick. Maya wore the same paint-stained coveralls and kept her graying hair pulled back under a faded bandana. To them, she was simply the mysterious artist, the homeless woman who'd created something impossible in an abandoned barn. They had no idea they were looking at Dr. Meredith Chen, whose theoretical work on environmental biosystems had once been classified at the highest levels. "How did you do this?" asked a teenager with purple streaks in her hair, gesturing at the walls where bioluminescent panels pulsed in rhythm with the heartbeats of everyone in the room. "Nature does the work," Maya replied, which was both completely true and utterly misleading. The living walls were indeed natural organisms, but they'd been genetically modified using techniques that wouldn't be legally available for civilian use for another decade. "I just provide the conditions for growth." More cars arrived throughout the morning. Maya watched the visitor count climb. Dozens, then hundreds. Food trucks appeared as if summoned, along with reporters, art critics, and social media influencers armed with professional camera equipment. By noon, someone had set up a merchandise table selling hastily printed T-shirts with photos of the barn. Maya felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always preceded a crisis. Control was slipping away, and with it, her carefully maintained anonymity. She'd grown careless, seduced by the joy of creation and the hunger for connection she'd spent 5 years suppressing. A black sedan with government plates pulled in around 2 o'clock. Maya was leading a group through the central chamber when she spotted the car through one of the barn's organic windows, living membranes that could shift from transparent to opaque at will. 2 figures in dark suits emerged, and even from a distance, their purposeful movements mocked them as federal agents. Her hands trembled as she continued her explanation of the carbon cycle visualization overhead, her voice steady despite the alarms screaming in her mind. They couldn't have found her. The facial recognition software should have been fooled by the changes she'd made to her appearance, the weight loss, the deliberate aging. She'd been so careful. But the barn itself was a signature, wasn't it? The biological technologies, the theoretical frameworks made manifest, it was all too sophisticated, too advanced. She'd let her ego override her caution, creating something that could only have come from someone with her specific knowledge and expertise. The agents entered the barn with the careful precision of people accustomed to finding exactly what they were looking for. Maya watched them from behind a curtain of living moss, her escape routes already mapped in her mind. The hidden passage to the basement, the tunnel she'd excavated that led to the tree line, the cache of supplies and false documents she'd buried 2 miles away. But as she prepared to run, something unexpected happened. The other visitors, the genuine admirers who'd come to experience her creation, began to form a protective barrier around the space. Not intentionally, but simply by being present, by filling every corner with their wonder and enthusiasm. The agents found themselves swept up in impromptu tours, bombarded with questions about whether this would become a permanent installation, whether the government would help preserve it. Maya realized she had a choice. She could disappear again, leave the barn to be dissected by investigators who would never understand its true purpose. Or she could stay and fight for what she'd built, even if it meant risking exposure. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, she made her decision. The knock came at dawn, sharp and insistent against the barn's newly reinforced door. Maya froze, her hands still wrapped around the warm cup of coffee she'd been savoring while watching the sunrise paint her sanctuary in golden hues. Through the months of transformation, no one had ever approached the barn directly. Visitors always gathered at the edge of the property, respecting the invisible boundary she'd somehow established. She moved silently to the small window she'd installed near the entrance, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. A woman in a crisp navy suit stood outside, her posture rigid with purpose. Everything about her screamed government official, from her sensible shoes to the leather briefcase clutched in her manicured hands. Maya's blood turned to ice. "Miss Chen, I know you're in there," the woman called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "My name is Director Sarah Walsh from the Department of Cultural Heritage. We need to talk." The coffee cup slipped from Maya's nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor she'd so carefully restored. The sound echoed through the space like a gunshot. They knew her real name. After 3 years of being invisible, of carefully constructing a life where Maya Chen had ceased to exist, they'd found her. She pressed her back against the wall, mind racing through possibilities. Run. She could slip out the back entrance she'd built for emergencies, disappear into the woods before anyone knew she was gone, but the thought of abandoning everything she'd built here, the community center disguised as an art installation, the safe haven she'd created for people like herself, felt like tearing out her own heart. "I'm not here about Beijing," Director Walsh continued, her tone softening slightly. "I'm here about what you've done to this place, what you're doing for people." Maya's breath caught. Beijing. The word hung in the air like smoke from a long-extinguished fire. She'd spent so many sleepless nights wondering if they'd ever connect the dots, if anyone would recognize the architectural techniques she'd unconsciously woven into the barn's renovation. The sustainable engineering principles she'd pioneered during her former life as one of China's most celebrated urban planners had become as natural to her as breathing. Through the window, she watched Director Walsh step closer to the door, studying the intricate carved patterns Maya had etched into the wood during countless midnight hours. Those patterns told stories of displacement, of finding home in unexpected places, of community rising from abandonment. They were her signature, as distinctive as a fingerprint. "The environmental innovations you've implemented here," Walsh continued, "the way you've created a completely self-sustaining ecosystem while maintaining the barn's historical integrity, it's remarkable. We've had engineers trying to figure out your water reclamation system for weeks." They'd been watching, studying. Maya closed her eyes, remembering another time when her innovations had been scrutinized, praised, celebrated, before everything had gone wrong, before the project that was supposed to revolutionize urban housing had collapsed, taking 37 lives with it, before the investigation that had cleared her of wrongdoing but destroyed her faith in herself, before she'd chosen to disappear rather than risk failing again. "There are people who want to replicate what you've done here," Walsh said. "Cities facing housing crises, communities that need exactly this kind of sustainable development. You could help millions of people." Through the gaps in the curtain, Maya could see the morning's first visitors beginning to gather at the property line. Mrs. Rodriguez, with her thermos of café con leche, probably intending to tend the community garden Maya had helped her plant in the barn's south corner. Tommy, the teenager who'd been sleeping rough until Maya had quietly arranged for him to have a safe corner in the barn's upper loft. Sarah, the veteran with PTSD, who found peace in the meditation space Maya had created among the rafters. Her small, secret world was about to be exposed to harsh daylight. "I know what happened in Beijing wasn't your fault," Walsh said quietly. "The investigation proved that. The subcontractor who used substandard materials, the inspector who falsified reports. None of that was on you, but running away didn't help those people who needed your expertise." Maya's hands were shaking now. She thought of the families living in the housing complex she'd designed, the ones who deed survived because most of her safety innovations had worked exactly as intended. She thought of the communities that might benefit from what she'd learned in her 3 years of exile, the lessons in small-scale sustainability she'd perfected through necessity and desperation. "I'll give you 24 hours to think about it," Director Walsh said, placing something against the door. "But Maya, hiding isn't going to protect anyone, not anymore." The footsteps retreated, but Maya remained frozen against the wall, listening to her carefully constructed anonymity crumble like the coffee cup at her feet. The morning after the television interview, Maya awoke to find 17 cars parked along the dirt road leading to her barn. She watched from her small window as strangers wandered her property, some taking photographs, others simply standing and staring at the structure that had become her life's work. She expected visitors, but not this many, not this soon. The segment had aired only 12 hours ago, yet word was already spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. Her phone, a cheap device she'd bought months ago for emergencies, buzzed incessantly with notifications from numbers she didn't recognize. Maya pulled on her worn jacket and stepped outside. A young woman with a professional camera turned toward her, eyes lighting with recognition. "Are you her? The artist who built all this?" Maya nodded carefully. She had learned long ago to measure her words, to reveal only what was necessary. "Can I help you?" "This is incredible," the woman continued, gesturing toward the barn. "I'm a freelance photographer. Would you mind if I documented some of the details? The way you've integrated the solar panels with the living walls is revolutionary." As Maya led the photographer around the property, explaining the water reclamation system and the vertical gardens, she noticed a black sedan pulling up behind the other vehicles. Two men in dark suits emerged, and Maya's blood turned cold. They moved with the purposeful stride of federal agents, their eyes scanning the crowd before settling on her. She had always known this day might come. For 3 years, she had lived off the grid, invisible to the systems that had once tracked her every movement. But the television interview had been a beacon, broadcasting her face and location to anyone who might be looking. The photographer was still talking, something about sustainable architecture and environmental innovation, but Maya's attention was fixed on the approaching figures. She recognized the type even if she didn't know the faces, clean-shaven, alert, carrying themselves with the authority of people accustomed to asking questions and receiving answers. "Excuse me," Maya said to the photographer, stepping away from the group of visitors who had gathered around them. She needed to think, to plan. The barn had become too important to too many people to simply abandon, but staying meant confronting the very past she had worked so hard to escape. She slipped through the barn's main entrance, weaving between the hanging gardens and water features toward the small office space she had constructed in the rear. Her hands shook as she opened a hidden panel in the wall, retrieving a manila envelope she had hoped never to touch again. Inside were documents that told a different story than the one she had shared with the world. Birth certificates, university transcripts, government clearances, and finally, the letter that had changed everything. The letter that had forced Dr. Sarah Chen, former environmental engineer for the Department of Defense, to disappear and become Maya, a homeless woman with nothing to lose. The barn's transformation hadn't been the work of an untrained wanderer with an eye for beauty. Every system, every innovation, every carefully calculated angle had been designed by someone with advanced degrees in environmental engineering and sustainable technology. Someone who had once worked on classified projects involving water purification in hostile environments and energy generation in remote locations. Someone who had discovered her own government was using her research to contaminate water supplies in foreign nations rather than purify them. Footsteps echoed through the barn, and Maya recognized the measured pace of the men from the sedan. She had perhaps minutes before they found her. The envelope felt heavy in her hands, weighted with the knowledge that had cost her everything once before. But looking around the barn, seeing the families who had driven hours to witness her work, hearing the excited voices of children discovering the butterfly sanctuary she had created, Maya realized something had changed. This wasn't just about her anymore. The barn had become a symbol, proof that damaged things could be rebuilt into something beautiful and useful. She thought about the photographer's words, about environmental revolution and sustainable innovation. Perhaps it was time to stop running from what she had once been and find a way to use it. Maya tucked the envelope inside her jacket and walked toward the front of the barn. The two agents were examining the water filtration system, their expressions unreadable. When they saw her approaching, the taller one reached into his jacket, but instead of credentials, he produced a tablet computer. "Dr. Chen," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for her to hear. "We need to talk." Maya glanced around at the visitors still exploring her creation, at the children pressing their faces against the glass walls of the greenhouse section, at the photographer capturing images that would spread her work even further. "Yes," she said finally. "I suppose we do." The morning sun cast long shadows across the meadow as Maya watched the first tour bus pull up the gravel road. Her stomach twisted into familiar knots as 23 strangers emerged, cameras already clicking, voices carrying across the air that had once been hers alone. "Welcome to the sanctuary," called Janet, the volunteer coordinator Maya had reluctantly agreed to work with. "Please remember this is both an art installation and a wildlife preserve. We ask that you respect both the space and its creator's privacy." Maya retreated deeper into the barn's upper loft, watching through gaps in the reclaimed wood as the group approached the entrance. She'd spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for this moment, reinforcing the sections where curious hands might wander, securing anything that might reveal more than she intended. The installation had grown beyond her wildest imagination over the past months. What began as a simple shelter had evolved into a living cathedral where art and nature intertwined. Salvaged materials formed spiraling sculptures that seemed to breathe with the wind. Gardens cascaded through carefully planned openings in the walls, creating an ecosystem where wounded animals could heal while visitors experienced something that defied easy categorization. But as she watched the tourists move through her creation, pointing and photographing, Maya felt the familiar urge to run. The attention was becoming impossible to manage. Yesterday, a reporter from the arts section of a major newspaper had shown up unannounced. The day before, someone claiming to be a documentary filmmaker. Each time, Maya had slipped away through the back passages she'd built into the structure, leaving Janet or one of the other volunteers to handle the inquiries. The mysterious creator prefers to let the work speak for itself had become Janet's standard response. But Maya knew that wouldn't satisfy people forever. A child's laugh drew her attention back to the tour group below. A little girl had discovered the section where Maya had created a series of kaleidoscope windows using broken bottles and mirrors. As the child moved, colored light danced across her face, and for a moment Maya remembered why she'd started this project. It wasn't about hiding, it was about healing. The tour moved on, and Maya was about to emerge from the loft when she heard a voice that made her blood freeze. Fascinating use of negative space. Very reminiscent of Richardson's later work. Dr. James Hartwell, her former professor, mentor, and the man whose recommendation had launched her career at the prestigious Meridian Gallery. Maya pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering. What was he doing here? The sanctuary had gained attention, but surely not enough to draw someone from his rarefied academic circles. The integration of found materials suggests someone with formal training, he continued, and Maya could hear him moving closer to the area directly below her hiding spot. But there's something raw here, uncompromising, like the artist has been stripped of everything except pure vision. Maya closed her eyes, remembering the woman she'd been 3 years ago, Dr. Elena Vasquez, rising star of the contemporary art world. Her installations had commanded 6-figure prices, museums had courted her, critics had hailed her as the voice of a new generation. Until the night, everything collapsed. Until Marcus Chen's betrayal destroyed not just her career, but her identity, forcing her to disappear completely to survive. "Sir?" Janet's voice interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "I'm sorry, but the tour is moving on to the next section." "Of course. It's just, I knew an artist once who worked with similar themes. Brilliant woman. I often wonder what happened to her." Maya waited until the voices faded before allowing herself to breathe. Through the window, she watched Dr. Hartwell rejoin the group, but something in his posture suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with the official tour. As the bus finally pulled away, Maya climbed down to survey her sanctuary with new eyes. How long before someone else made the connection? How long before her carefully constructed new life crumbled like the old one? But as she moved through the space she'd created, past the rescued owl's perch and the meditation alcove where stressed visitors often lingered, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't the sterile gallery world she'd left behind. This was real, messy, alive. A soft, scratching sound drew her attention to the far corner, where Gideon, the 3-legged fox she'd nursed back to health, was investigating a new sculpture. He'd stayed even after his recovery, claiming the sanctuary as his territory. "What do you think, old friend?" she whispered. "Do we run again, or do we stay and fight?" Gideon regarded her with intelligent amber eyes before returning to his exploration. Maya smiled despite her fear. Perhaps it was time to stop running from Elena Vasquez and figure out how to integrate her past with Maya's present. The question was whether the world would let her. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows Sarah had installed months ago, casting rainbow patterns across the workshop floor where children from 3 different continents were collaborating on a massive sculpture made entirely from recycled ocean plastic. She watched from the loft above, her heart swelling with pride and terror in equal measure. Marcus Chen had been calling every day for the past week. Each time his name appeared on her phone, her stomach clenched with the familiar dread of discovery. She'd stopped answering altogether, but his voicemails grew more persistent, more knowing. "Sarah, I know you're screening my calls. We need to talk about Geneva, about the Hartwell Foundation, about what really happened 15 years ago." The last message had arrived at 3 in the morning, when she'd been unable to sleep, pacing the barn's upper level like a caged animal. She'd listened to it 17 times, passing every inflection, every pause, trying to determine how much he actually knew versus how much he was fishing for. Below her, Dr. Elena Vasquez was leading a group of refugee children through an art therapy session, their small hands working clay while they shared stories in a mixture of languages. Elena had become more than a volunteer coordinator. She was Sarah's closest friend, the person who knew her better than anyone had in years. Almost anyone. The thought of Elena's face when the truth came out made Sarah's chest tighten painfully. "Sarah?" Elena's voice drifted up from below. "The documentary crew is here for the final interviews." Sarah closed her eyes. The documentary about the barn's transformation was supposed to be their triumph, a way to share their model with communities worldwide. Instead, it felt like a countdown to her exposure. She'd agreed to be interviewed on camera for the first time, a decision that now seemed catastrophically stupid. She descended the spiral staircase she'd built from salvaged ship parts, each step echoing like a funeral march. The BBC crew was setting up their equipment near the community garden, where tomatoes grew in planters made from old paint cans and herbs flourished in a vertical garden constructed from plastic bottles. Miss Chen, the producer, a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria Brennan, extended her hand. "Thank you for finally agreeing to speak on camera. The world is fascinated by what you've accomplished here." Sarah forced a smile, hoping her hands weren't visibly shaking. "I'm not the story. This place, these people, the community we've built, that's what matters. But surely you understand that your personal journey is part of what makes this so compelling. From homelessness to creating something that's inspired similar projects in 47 countries, people want to know who you are. Who you are." The words hit like physical blows. Sarah glanced around the barn, taking in the impossible beauty they'd created together. The children's laughter echoed from the art studio. The scent of fresh bread wafted from the community kitchen, where formerly homeless individuals now taught cooking classes. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, powering the computers where teenagers learned coding and adults attended virtual job interviews. All of it would survive her, she realized. It had grown beyond her, become something larger and more resilient than one person's secrets. The thought brought both comfort and profound sadness. "Let's begin with how you found this place," Victoria said once the cameras were rolling. Sarah told the sanitized version she'd perfected over the months. Unemployment, eviction, the gradual slide into homelessness, all true as far as it went. She spoke about the barn's condition when she'd first broken in during that terrible storm, about the slow accumulation of materials and tools, the first tentative improvements, and what drove you to keep going, to envision something so ambitious. This answer came easier because it was completely honest. I'd forgotten what it felt like to build something instead of just surviving. Every small improvement made me remember who I used to be, someone who could create, who could solve problems, who could make things better instead of worse. Tell us about your background. What skills did you bring to this project? The question she'd been dreading. Sarah's mouth went dry. In her peripheral vision, she saw Elena watching with encouraging warmth, dozens of volunteers and community members going about their daily activities in the space they all called home. Her phone buzzed. Marcus Chen. This time she answered. "Hello, Marcus." Sarah. His voice carried exhaustion and something that might have been sympathy. "I'm outside." Through the barn's main entrance, she could see a familiar figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun, tall, grey-haired, carrying himself with the same careful precision she remembered from committee meetings in Swiss conference rooms, from the investigation that had destroyed her previous life. "I think," she said quietly, aware that the cameras were still rolling, that Victoria was leaning forward with predatory interest, that Elena was beginning to look concerned. "We need to pause this interview." But she knew with absolute certainty that there would be no pausing what came next. The morning fog clung to the valley like a shroud, but Maya could already see the distant glint of news vans winding their way up the mountain road. Her sanctuary, once hidden and peaceful, now felt like a fishbowl under siege. She pressed her palm against the cool glass of the observatory window she'd installed in the barn's highest loft, watching the inevitable approach of her past. 3 days had passed since the documentary aired, and the world had exploded with speculation about the mysterious artist behind the barn transformation. Social media buzzed with theories, art critics penned breathless analyses, and worst of all, someone had started connecting dots that led dangerously close to Dr. Elena Vasquez, the disgraced physicist who had vanished 2 years ago after her quantum research facility had suffered a catastrophic accident. "Maya." James's voice carried up from below, gentle but urgent. "There's someone here you need to see." She descended the spiral staircase she'd crafted from reclaimed copper pipes, each step echoing in the vast space where holographic constellations still danced overhead from last night's community gathering. The barn had become more than an art installation. It was a living, breathing ecosystem of beauty and wonder that brought together everyone from local farmers to visiting scientists. At the main entrance stood a woman in an expensive charcoal suit, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Maya's blood turned to ice. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, former director of the Meridian Research Institute, and the person responsible for shutting down Maya's life's work. "Hello, Elena." Patricia's voice carried the same cold authority Maya remembered. "Or do you prefer Maya now?" James looked between them, confusion creasing his weathered features. "Maya? What's she talking about?" "Perhaps we should speak privately," Patricia suggested, her eyes scanning the barn's impossible geometries, walls that seemed to shift perspective, surfaces that reflected light in ways that defied physics, the gentle hum of energy that most visitors attributed to artistic ambiance, but Maya knew came from something far more complex. "Anything you have to say, you can say in front of James." Maya's voice was steadier than she felt. "This is his land, his community you're disturbing." Patricia smiled thinly. "Very well, I'm here about the technology you're using. The same technology that killed 3 people and injured dozens more when your laboratory suffered a quantum cascade failure." She gestured toward a section of wall where light seemed to bend around itself in an impossible spiral. "I can see you've learned to control it better, but that doesn't change what you did." "What she did was try to revolutionize clean energy," Maya said, surprised by her own words. For 2 years she'd carried the guilt like a stone in her chest, but standing in this place she'd built with her own hands, surrounded by the wonder and joy it brought to others, she felt something shift. The accident was caused by rushed timelines and inadequate safety protocols you approved despite my objections. James stepped closer to Maya, his presence solid and reassuring. "I don't know what history you two have, but I know Maya. She's transformed this entire community." Kids who never cared about anything now spend hours here learning about art and science. Families drive hundreds of miles just to experience what she's created. Built on stolen technology and a false identity, Patricia countered. She pulled out a tablet, swiping to display official-looking documents. The quantum manipulation techniques, the reality-bending materials. All of it belongs to Meridian Industries. We've been tracking unusual energy signatures, and they led us here. Maya felt the walls of her new life closing in. Everything she'd built, all the connections she'd forged, the love she'd found with James and this community. It could all disappear with a single phone call from Patricia. But then she heard them, voices outside, growing louder. Through the barn's translucent sections, she could see people gathering, not just the news crews, but locals. Dozens of them, carrying handmade signs and forming a protective circle around the barn's perimeter. "We won't let them take our sanctuary," someone shouted. Maya recognized Mrs. Chen's voice. "This place saved my daughter's life," called another. "She was lost after her father died, but working here with Maya gave her purpose again." Patricia's confident expression faltered as she realized she wasn't just facing one fugitive scientist, but an entire community united in protection of something precious. "You want to shut this down?" Maya asked, her voice growing stronger. "Look around you. Yes, I use techniques I developed at Meridian, but I've created something that brings healing, wonder, and education to hundreds of people. When did we decide that corporate ownership matters more than human flourishing?" Outside, the crowd's voices grew louder, and Maya could see even some of the news crews lowering their cameras, seemingly moved by the display of community solidarity. Patricia stared at the gathering crowd, then back at the impossible beauty surrounding them, calculation flickering in her eyes. The first news van arrived at dawn, its satellite dish cutting through the morning mist like a metallic flower reaching for the sky. Elena watched from the barn's loft window as the reporter adjusted her blazer and practiced her opening lines, gesturing toward the structure that had become Elena's sanctuary. "This is Sarah Chen reporting from rural Montana, where what locals are calling the Miracle Barn has captured international attention." Elena's hands trembled as she gripped the windowsill. 3 days had passed since the viral video exploded across social media platforms. 3 days since her carefully constructed anonymity began crumbling like autumn leaves. The barn that had once offered her solitude now stood exposed under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Below, Marcus emerged from his farmhouse, coffee mug in hand, his expression grim as he approached the reporter. Elena had seen that look before, the weight of secrets threatening to spill over. He'd been fielding calls since Monday, his phone ringing incessantly with requests for interviews, location scouts, and documentary filmmakers. The barn itself seemed to pulse with nervous energy. What had started as Elena's desperate attempt to create beauty from abandonment had evolved into something beyond her wildest imagination. The interior walls now told stories through intricately woven branches, recycled materials, and found objects she'd collected during her months of wandering. Sunlight filtered through carefully positioned glass bottles and mirrors, creating rainbows that danced across surfaces painted with natural pigments she'd made from local clay and crushed berries. But it wasn't just the visual spectacle that had captured the world's attention. Elena had unknowingly incorporated techniques she'd learned during her previous life, the life she'd tried so desperately to forget, the sophisticated understanding of light, space, and environmental psychology that had once made her one of the most sought-after architectural artists in Europe now betrayed her in this remote corner of Montana. A black sedan pulled up behind the news van, and Elena's blood turned to ice. 2 figures emerged, their movements efficient and purposeful. Even from this distance, she recognized the bearing of federal agents. Her past wasn't just catching up, it was here. "Elena?" Marcus's voice carried up from below. "You need to see this." She descended the ladder slowly, each rung feeling like a step toward inevitable exposure. Marcus stood in the center of the barn's main hall, holding his tablet with an expression of confusion and concern. "There's been a development," he said quietly. "The FBI issued a statement this morning." Elena's vision blurred at the edges, but she forced herself to focus on the screen. The headline made her knees buckle. "Wanted architect Elena Vasquez, believed to be creator of Montana Miracle Barn." "They're calling you a person of interest in the Venice incident," Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "They say you disappeared 2 years ago, right after the gallery bombing," Elena finished, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "After 17 people died in the building I designed." The truth hung between them like a physical presence. Marcus's face cycled through shock, understanding, and something that might have been betrayal. "The structural modifications I made to that historical building," Elena continued, needing to say it all before the agents reached them. "They think it contributed to the collapse, that I somehow knew about the attack." "Did you?" Marcus asked, and the question cut deeper than any accusation. "No," Elena said firmly, "but I made choices, architectural choices that prioritized aesthetics over certain safety protocols. When the bomb went off," she closed her eyes, remembering the phone call that had shattered her world. "The investigators found emails between me and the client, things taken out of context. I looked guilty enough that running seemed like the only option. Outside, car doors slammed with the finality of closing chapters. There's a service tunnel," Marcus said suddenly, "from the old Prohibition days. Connects to the creek bed about half a mile east." Elena stared at him, surprised by his quick shift to practical assistance. "I watched you build this," he gestured around the transformed space. "Whatever happened in Venice, this isn't the work of someone who wants to hurt people. This is healing made manifest." The barn's front doors creaked open, and authoritative voices echoed through the space Elena had thought of as her cathedral of redemption. "Elena Vasquez? FBI. We'd like to speak with you regarding the Venice gallery incident." She looked at Marcus one last time, memorizing his face, then at the walls she'd covered with hope and beauty. The morning light streaming through her carefully positioned windows painted everything in golden hues, as if the barn itself was saying goodbye. "I'm here," she called out, stepping forward into the light. No more running. Whatever came next, she would face it in the space where she'd learned to create again, surrounded by proof that broken things could indeed become beautiful. The agents approached, their footsteps echoing in the cathedral's silence. The helicopter circled overhead like a mechanical vulture, its rotors churning dust devils across the meadow. Maya pressed herself against the barn's main beam, watching through a crack in the wall as more vehicles arrived. News vans, police cars, and unmarked sedans formed a growing perimeter around her sanctuary. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the burner phone she'd kept hidden for emergencies. The number was burned into her memory, though she'd hoped never to use it again. 3 rings, then a familiar gravelly voice. "I wondered when you'd call, Dr. Chen." The name hit her like ice water. She'd been Elena Vasquez for 2 years now, had almost convinced herself that Dr. Lila Chen had died in that laboratory fire in Geneva. "Almost. Marcus," she whispered, "how did you find me?" "Your art installation went viral, Lila. Facial recognition software picked you up from the news footage. Did you really think you could hide forever by helping orphaned children?" Through the crack, Maya, Lila, watched Sarah directing the arriving reporters, her young face animated with excitement about sharing their project with the world. The irony was suffocating. She'd created this place to heal, to give these kids hope, and now her past would destroy everything they'd built together. "The children have nothing to do with this," she said into the phone. Marcus laughed, cold and mechanical. "Everything has to do with this. You stole classified research, Lila. Research that cost the government $40 million. Research that could revolutionize energy production. Research that could be weaponized." She closed her eyes, remembering the equations she'd memorized before destroying the hard drives. The clean fusion process she developed could power cities, or level them. That's why I ran. That's why you're coming back." The barn's side door creaked open. Tommy slipped inside, his usually bright demeanor replaced by worry. "Elena, there are people outside asking questions about you. Official-looking people." She ended the call and knelt beside the boy who'd become like a son to her. "Tommy, I need you to listen carefully. Find Sarah and the others. Tell them to pack only what they need and go to the emergency meeting place we talked about. Are we in danger?" His dark eyes searched her face for truth. Before she could answer, the barn's main doors burst open. Federal agents in dark suits poured in, weapons drawn but lowered. Behind them walked a man she recognized despite 2 years and 30 pounds, Marcus Webb, her former handler. "Dr. Lila Chen," he announced formally, "you're under arrest for theft of classified materials and violation of the Espionage Act." Tommy stepped protectively in front of her. "Leave Elena alone. She hasn't done anything wrong." More children appeared from the barn's hidden corners. Her kids, the ones she'd taught to paint and dream and believe in beauty. They formed a human shield around her, their faces fierce with loyalty. "Children, please step aside," Marcus said, his voice attempting kindness. "This woman isn't who you think she is. She's exactly who we think she is." Sarah appeared in the doorway, her chin raised defiantly. "She's the person who saved us." Lila's heart shattered. She gently moved Tommy aside and stepped forward. "It's okay. I'll go with them." "Elena, no!" Sarah rushed forward, but an agent intercepted her. "My real name is Dr. Lila Chen," she said to the children, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her chest. "I used to be a scientist. I made some difficult choices, and now I have to face the consequences." She looked at each young face, Tommy with his gap-toothed grin, Sarah with her fierce intelligence, Marcus Jr. with his quiet artistic soul, all the others who'd helped transform this barn from mere shelter into sanctuary. "But everything I told you about art, about beauty, about your worth, all of that was true. Don't let them tell you this place wasn't real. Don't let them take away what we built together." As the agents led her toward the door, she turned back one last time. The morning light streaming through the barn's windows illuminated the installation they'd created, thousands of recycled materials transformed into something transcendent. Solar panels powered LED strips that created aurora-like patterns across the walls. Mirrors and prisms cast rainbows that danced with the wind. Every piece told a story of redemption, of finding beauty in discarded things. "The passwords are in the place where we keep tomorrow's dreams," she called to Sarah, hoping the girl would remember their code for the hidden compartment containing the barn's legal documents and the trust fund she'd secretly established. Outside, protesters had already begun gathering, many holding signs supporting the homeless artist. News anchors spoke into cameras about the mysterious woman who'd captured the world's imagination. They had no idea that the real story, about classified fusion research and government secrets, was just beginning. As they placed her in the unmarked sedan, Lila caught sight of Tommy's face pressed against the barn window. She'd broken her promise to protect them, but maybe, somehow, what they'd created together would be stronger than her mistakes. The car pulled away, leaving her children and her sanctuary behind. The emergency town meeting had been called for 7 o'clock, but by 6:30, every seat in the community center was filled. Sarah watched from the back corner, hood pulled low, as neighbors who had welcomed her with open arms now whispered behind cupped hands. The energy in the room crackled with tension and betrayal. Mayor Davidson's hands shook as he shuffled through the papers before him. The revelation about Sarah's identity had hit him harder than most. He'd been the one championing her cause, the one who'd stood before cameras praising the mysterious woman who'd brought their dying town back to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice strained, "I think we all know why we're here tonight." Dr. Elena Rodriguez sat in the front row, her laptop open to the damning news article that had broken that morning. The headline burned in Sarah's memory: "Fugitive art forger behind miraculous town revival." Beside Elena's professional headshot was Sarah's old mugshot, the resemblance undeniable despite the years and weathering that had changed her face. "The woman we've known as Sarah has been living among us under false pretenses," Davidson continued. "Dr. Rodriguez has some concerns about the legitimacy of our project." Elena stood, her designer suit a stark contrast to the flannel and denim surrounding her. "I've completed my preliminary analysis of the artwork in question. While the pieces demonstrate remarkable skill, I cannot authenticate them without proper provenance documentation. Given Miss..." She paused, consulting her notes. "Given Miss Catherine Morrison's criminal history involving art forgery, I must recommend immediate suspension of all museum operations pending a full investigation." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Sarah's stomach dropped. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but hearing her real name spoken aloud felt like a physical blow. "Now hold on just a minute," called out Martha from the diner. "I don't care what her name is or what she did before. That woman saved my business, saved all our businesses." "Martha's right," added Jim from the hardware store. "My sales have tripled since tourists started coming through. My boy can afford to stay in college now because of her." But others weren't as forgiving. Robert Chen, who owned the struggling grocery store, stood with arms crossed. "She lied to us, made fools of us all. How do we know anything she told us was true? How do we know those paintings aren't stolen?" Sarah felt the familiar weight of her past crushing down on her chest. She'd spent 3 years building something real, something meaningful, and now it was crumbling just like everything else she'd ever touched. Elena raised her hand for silence. "The paintings appear to be original works, not stolen pieces. However, without proper documentation of their creation and ownership, the museum cannot maintain its credibility. The art world is already buzzing with speculation. Some are calling it the greatest hoax of the decade." Through the community center's windows, Sarah could see the news vans that had descended on their quiet town like vultures. Reporters with camera crews wandered the streets, interviewing anyone willing to talk. The peaceful sanctuary she'd created had become a circus. "What about the restoration work?" asked young Tommy, who'd been helping Sarah with the barn's maintenance. "She taught me things about art I never knew. Real things." "The craftsmanship is undeniable," Elena admitted. "Whoever created those pieces possesses extraordinary talent. But talent without legitimacy is just elaborate deception." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. She thought about the countless hours she'd spent in that barn, pouring her soul onto canvas after canvas, the sleepless nights mixing pigments, the careful research into historical techniques, the pure joy of creation without the pressure of forgery. Those paintings were more honest than anything she'd ever produced in her previous life. "We need to vote," Davidson announced reluctantly. "All in favor of temporarily closing the museum until this matter is resolved?" Hands began to rise around the room. Sarah watched as the community that had embraced her slowly, reluctantly, chose self-preservation over loyalty. She couldn't blame them. They had businesses to protect, reputations to maintain. As the count reached a clear majority, Sarah quietly slipped toward the door. Outside, the cool night air hit her face like a slap. The news crews were packing up their equipment, having gotten enough footage of the small-town drama to satisfy their editors. She walked slowly toward the barn, her sanctuary that would soon be sealed off like a crime scene. The paintings inside represented the only pure thing she'd ever created, and now they would be examined, questioned, and ultimately dismissed as the work of a criminal. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd finally stopped being a forger, only to have her authentic work branded as fake by association. The truth of her artistry didn't matter. The stain of her past had poisoned everything she'd touched. As she reached the barn doors, Sarah realized she had one last choice to make. The weight of recognition pressed down on Clara like a suffocating blanket as she watched the news van's satellite dish extend toward the darkening sky. 3 more vehicles had arrived in the past hour, their headlights cutting harsh lines through the peaceful sanctuary she'd built. The barn's warm glow, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a spotlight exposing every carefully buried secret. Marcus stood beside her at the kitchen window of the farmhouse, his weathered hands gripping a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "We could ask them to leave," he said quietly, though they both knew it was futile. The story had already broken on social media. Aerial footage of the transformed barn, with its stunning murals and impossible gardens, was spreading faster than wildfire. "They have a right to be here," Clara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's public land adjacent to the road." She touched the glass, her fingerprint joining dozens of others that Maria's children had left during their visits. Those innocent smudges seemed to mock her now, evidence of the life she'd tried to build, the connections she'd foolishly allowed herself to form. A sharp knock echoed through the house. Marcus moved to answer it, but Clara caught his arm. Through the front window, she could see a woman in a pressed blazer holding a microphone, a cameraman shifting restlessly behind her. Not just any reporter. Clara recognized her from the morning shows, one of those relentless investigators who prided themselves on exposing the truth behind feel-good stories. "Miss Delacroix?" the reporter called out, her voice carrying easily through the old windows. "Jennifer Walsh, Channel 7 News, we'd love to speak with you about your incredible transformation of this space." Clara's blood turned to ice. The name hit her like a physical blow. Not because the reporter had gotten it right, but because she'd gotten it terrifyingly wrong. Delacroix was close, too close, to another name, a name that belonged to a woman who died 3 years ago in a car accident outside Phoenix, whose identity Clara had carefully, illegally assumed. Marcus shot her a questioning look, but Clara was already moving, grabbing her worn jacket from the back of a chair. "I need to get to the barn," she said. "There are things there I need to secure." "Clara, what's going on?" Marcus's voice carried an edge of concern that cut through her panic. "Who's Delacroix?" She paused at the back door, her hand on the knob. In the distance, she could see more lights approaching, not just news crews now, but cars full of curious visitors drawn by the social media frenzy. The parking area Maria had helped her establish was overflowing. People were walking through the carefully tended paths with their phones raised, capturing everything. "Someone I used to be," she said finally. "Someone I can never be again." The back door led to a path that wound through Marcus's vegetable garden toward the barn. Clara moved quickly, staying in the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd been careful for so long, paying in cash, avoiding cameras, keeping her head down. But the barn had required permits, inspections, official documentation. She'd used the stolen identity because she'd had no choice, and now that choice was about to destroy everything. Inside the barn, the evening crowd was smaller than usual but more intense. Visitors moved through the space with an energy that felt different, less reverent, more consuming. She watched a teenager pose for selfies in front of the memorial wall, making exaggerated expressions of sadness for her followers. Clara made her way to the small office she'd built in the corner, her movements automatic despite the chaos in her mind. The filing cabinet held all the documentation for the barn's non-profit status, the permits, the donation records. Buried in the bottom drawer was something else, a manila envelope containing the only remnants of her real identity. The identity she'd abandoned when running became the only option. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out the envelope. Inside were documents that could vindicate her, prove that the money she'd used to transform this place had been legally earned, that her past, while complicated, wasn't criminal. But they also contained a name that powerful people had spent considerable resources trying to erase from existence. Dr. Catherine Delacroix. Not Delacroix, but close enough to make that reporter's mispronunciation feel like a warning shot. The woman who'd blown the whistle on Meridian Pharmaceuticals' cover-up of clinical trial data. The woman who'd watched her colleagues die in suspicious accidents before she'd finally run. Outside, she could hear more vehicles arriving, voices calling her false name. The barn's magic was being consumed by the very attention it had attracted, transformed from sanctuary into spectacle. Clara clutched the envelope to her chest and closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice settling over her once again. The satellite images spread across Detective Morrison's desk like a damning timeline. Each photograph showed the barn's transformation over the past 18 months, but it was the thermal imaging that made his blood run cold. The underground network beneath the property glowed orange and red, a vast labyrinth that shouldn't exist. "Sarah Chen isn't just hiding her identity," Morrison said into his phone, staring at the anomalous heat signatures. "She's been building something down there, something big." On the other end, Agent Torres's voice crackled with urgency. The facial recognition came back. Positive match. Sarah Chen is Dr. Elena Vasquez, former head of biochemical research at Meridian Labs. She disappeared 3 years ago, right before the congressional hearings. Morrison's pen stopped moving. Meridian Labs, the pharmaceutical giant that had poisoned an entire town's water supply, then covered it up. Hundreds had died. Vasquez had been set to testify when she vanished, taking crucial evidence with her. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered. "She's the one who could have brought them down." Could have. Now she's building something in that barn, and half the world's media is camped outside. Whatever she's planning, she's got the perfect cover. 3 miles away, in the barn's hidden underground laboratory, Sarah worked frantically at her computer terminal. The news vans outside had multiplied overnight, and she could hear helicopters circling overhead. Time was running out faster than she'd anticipated. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, uploading terabytes of data to secure servers across the globe. The Meridian files, evidence of systematic poisoning, falsified safety reports, bribed officials, everything she'd stolen before disappearing into the shadows. But that wasn't all she'd been working on down here. The laboratory stretched through converted root cellars and hand-dug tunnels, a marvel of hidden engineering. Biosynthesis equipment hummed quietly in climate-controlled chambers. Rows of sample containers lined reinforced shelving. This wasn't just a hiding place, it was a production facility. "Almost finished," she murmured to herself, monitoring the upload progress. 87% complete. Above her, footsteps echoed through the barn. Marcus was giving another tour to potential investors, his voice carrying down through the ventilation system she'd carefully designed to look decorative. He had no idea what lay beneath his feet, no idea that the woman he'd fallen in love with was simultaneously the most wanted whistleblower in corporate America and the architect of something that could change everything. The antidote was ready. 3 years of work using Meridian's own research against them. She'd synthesized a compound that could neutralize the toxins still ravaging survivors of the contamination, the same poison that had killed her sister. Her hands trembled as she prepared the final batch. Maria's face haunted every calculation, every late night in this hidden lab. Sweet Maria, who'd trusted the water, trusted the assurances that everything was safe, who died choking on her own blood while Meridian's executives planned their cover-up strategy. A soft chime indicated the upload was complete. Every news outlet in the world now had access to the Meridian files, but Sarah wasn't done. She activated the barn's hidden speaker system, her voice carrying to every corner of the property above. "Marcus, I need you to listen carefully. Get everyone out of the barn, now." The footsteps above stopped. "Sarah, where are you? Please, just trust me. Get everyone out and keep them back at least 50 yards. Through the security monitors she'd installed, Sarah watched Marcus shepherd the confused investors toward the exits. His face was etched with worry and bewilderment. She ached knowing what this revelation would do to him, to them, but there was no other way. Outside, Detective Morrison's unmarked car pulled up behind the news vans. He stepped out, studying the barn with new eyes. The woman who'd captivated the world with her story of transformation was Elena Vasquez. The question was what she'd been transforming down there in the dark. Sarah sealed the last containers of antidote into a specialized cooling unit and activated the barn's automated delivery system, another hidden marvel that would emerge from beneath the floorboards. The containers would be launched to predetermined coordinates, hospitals, research facilities, and medical centers in contaminated zones. She'd spent 3 years perfecting the plan. Disappear, build, synthesize, and deploy. Use the world's attention on her remarkable barn to ensure maximum coverage when the truth finally emerged. The upload notification flashed green. Every major news network now possessed evidence that would destroy Meridian Labs forever. And in 12 minutes, the delivery system would activate, sending the antidote to those who needed it most. Sarah climbed the hidden stairs to the barn's main floor one last time. Through the windows, she could see Marcus standing with the confused investors, his eyes scanning desperately for her. Beyond them, Detective Morrison approached with grim determination. Her transformation was complete, but not the kind the world expected. The homeless woman with hidden pain was about to become Elena Vasquez again, and Elena Vasquez had promises to keep. The morning light filtered through the barn's skylights, casting long shadows across the space that had become Elena's sanctuary. She moved quietly among the rows of easels, her fingers trailing over canvases that told stories of transformation, hope, and redemption. Each painting was a piece of her soul, a fragment of the life she'd built from nothing in this forgotten corner of the world. The sound of approaching vehicles shattered the peaceful silence. Elena's blood turned to ice as she recognized the distinctive rumble of news vans, their engines cutting through the early morning stillness like knives. She pressed herself against the window, watching as a convoy of vehicles descended upon the property. Reporters, cameras, and worst of all, a sleek black sedan that made her stomach clench with dread. She had perhaps minutes before they reached the barn. The weight of 17 years in hiding crashed down upon her shoulders as she frantically gathered the most precious paintings, the ones that revealed too much, said too much about who she really was. Her hands shook as she rolled canvases and stuffed them into a worn duffel bag that had been her companion through countless nights on the streets. The barn door burst open just as she zipped the bag closed. Detective Morrison stepped inside, his badge gleaming in the morning light, followed by a swarm of reporters whose cameras clicked and whirred like mechanical vultures. Behind them came the faces she recognized from television screens in shop windows, art critics, gallery owners, and journalists who had turned her story into a sensation. Vivian Cross, Detective Morrison's voice echoed through the space, using the name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in nearly 2 decades. You're under arrest for the murder of Marcus Thornfield. The cameras captured everything, her face pale with shock, the magnificent murals that covered every inch of the barn walls, the sculptures that seemed to breathe with life, the garden visible through the back windows where vegetables grew in perfect rows between flowering vines, everything she had built, everything she had become, frozen forever in this moment of destruction. Elena, Vivian, felt the familiar numbness creep over her. The same protective shell that had carried her through the original trial, through the appeals, through the night she'd walked away from her old life forever. She watched as if from a great distance as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, as reporters shouted questions she couldn't process, as her sanctuary filled with strangers who saw only a story to be consumed. The homeless artist who captured the world's heart, she heard one reporter say into a microphone. Actually, a convicted murderer who escaped justice 17 years ago. Tom appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of confusion and betrayal. Behind him stood Sarah from the farmer's market, old Pete who brought her supplies, and dozens of others from the community that had embraced her. Their expressions shifted from shock to hurt to something that looked like mourning as they realized the woman they'd known was disappearing before their eyes. Elena? Tom's voice cracked as he spoke. Is it true? She met his gaze across the crowded barn, seeing in his eyes the reflection of her own breaking heart. How could she explain that both versions of herself were real, that the woman who had created beauty from nothing in this barn was as authentic as the frightened girl who had been convicted of a crime she didn't commit? That 17 years of hiding had taught her the difference between guilt and shame, between running away and moving forward. I didn't kill him, she said, her voice barely audible above the chaos. It was the first time she'd spoken those words aloud since the trial, and they felt both foreign and familiar on her tongue. I never killed him. But the words were lost in the noise of shuttering cameras and shouted questions. Detective Morrison guided her toward the door, past the mural she'd painted of a phoenix rising from ashes, past the sculpture garden where broken things had been transformed into beauty, past all the evidence of the life she'd managed to build despite everything. As they reached the barn entrance, Elena turned back for one last look. The morning sun streamed through the skylights, illuminating the space that had been her home, her gallery, her entire world. Reporters crawled over everything like ants at a picnic, their presence contaminating the sanctuary she'd created with such painstaking care. She thought of the little girl who used to paint in secret, of the young woman whose life had been shattered by false accusations, of the homeless wanderer who had discovered that home wasn't a place but a choice to stop running. All of those women lived within her, and all of them were about to face whatever came next. The barn grew smaller in the rear window of the police car as they drove away, but Elena kept watching until it disappeared entirely, taking with it the last chapter of the life she'd thought she might actually get to keep. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barn as Maya stood before the assembled crowd, her weathered hands trembling slightly. The revelation of her identity as Dr. Elena Vasquez had spread like wildfire overnight, and now hundreds of faces stared back at her, some curious, some accusatory, others filled with a mixture of awe and betrayal. Sarah stepped forward, positioning herself beside Maya with unwavering loyalty. Before anyone says another word, you need to understand what this woman has given us all. Detective Rodriguez emerged from the crowd, his expression unreadable. Maya's breath caught in her throat as their eyes met. She had run from him for so long, yet here he stood in the place she had come to call home. "Dr. Elena Vasquez," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent gathering, "wanted for questioning in connection with the pharmaceutical scandal that rocked Meridian Industries 5 years ago." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Maya felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble, but she forced herself to stand straighter. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I am Elena Vasquez, and everything Marcus Rodriguez just said is true." The admission sent another wave of whispers through the gathering. Maya noticed several people stepping backward, as if her words had physically pushed them away. "But there's more to the story," Rodriguez continued, pulling a folder from his jacket. 5 years of investigation have revealed the truth that Elena, Maya, was trying to expose when she disappeared. Maya's eyes widened in shock. This was not how she had imagined this moment would unfold. Rodriguez opened the folder, his voice gaining strength. The contaminated medications that killed dozens weren't the result of Dr. Vasquez's research. They were the product of corporate cost-cutting measures that she had been fighting against for months. When she threatened to go public, they made her the scapegoat. The crowd's energy shifted palpably. Maya felt tears streaming down her face as years of guilt and shame began to lift from her shoulders. She ran because she knew they would destroy her before the truth could come out, Rodriguez continued. But Maya didn't just hide. She spent these years helping people in ways that no laboratory or boardroom ever could. Sarah reached for Maya's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Tell them the rest," she whispered. Maya looked out at the faces before her, the artists, the homeless individuals she had helped, the volunteers who had become her family, and the countless visitors whose lives had been touched by this place. "I lost everything 5 years ago," Maya began, her voice growing steadier with each word. "My career, my reputation, my identity. I ended up on the streets with nothing but guilt and the clothes on my back. I wanted to disappear completely." She gestured toward the barn behind her, its walls now covered with magnificent murals that told stories of hope, resilience, and human connection. "But this place taught me that disappearing isn't the same as becoming invisible to suffering. Every person who found refuge here, every artist who discovered their voice, every moment of beauty we created together, this became my real work." An elderly man stepped forward from the crowd. Maya recognized him as George, one of the first people she had helped when she found the barn. "I don't care what name you use," he said gruffly. "You saved my life. You gave me back my dignity when the world had thrown me away." Others began to speak up. Teresa, whose daughter had found healing through the art programs. James, who had overcome addiction with the support of the community Maya had fostered. One by one, voices rose in defense of the woman who had transformed their lives. "The warrant for your arrest has been withdrawn," Rodriguez announced, raising his voice above the growing chorus of support. "Meridian Industries executives were indicted last month. Your name has been cleared." Maya staggered backward, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his words. Sarah caught her arm, steadying her. "What does this mean for the barn?" someone called out from the crowd. Maya looked around at the extraordinary place they had all built together. The community garden flourishing in the morning light, the workshop spaces humming with creative energy, the living areas that had provided shelter for so many. "It means," Maya said, finding her voice again, "that we continue. Not because I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez or because I'm Maya the homeless woman, but because we've proven that broken things can be made beautiful again, that forgotten people deserve to be seen. That hope isn't a luxury, it's a necessity." The crowd erupted in applause, and Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years, the possibility of a future without fear. As the gathering gradually dispersed, people returning to their work and their lives within the barn's embrace, Maya remained standing in the morning sun. She was no longer running, no longer hiding. She was exactly where she belonged.